In late February 1836, the most famous battle of the Texas Revolution began. The Siege of the Alamo Mission. Defended by fewer than 300 Texans, the mission walls were turned into an improvised fort. Among its defenders were Colonel William Travis, James Bowie, and former U.S. Congressman and folk legend Davy Crockett. The Texans were surrounded on all sides and besieged for 13 days by Santa Anna's army. Before a final night assault on March 6, 1836, the battle was brutal, and Santa Anna ordered that no prisoners be taken. The handful of prisoners who managed to survive the massacre were also executed. The Battle of the Alamo became a battle cry for Texans still fighting and fueled the Texan army. In the weeks that followed, just over a month later, the Texas Revolution ended in victory for the people of Texas. After the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836, the Texas Revolution lasted less than a year and led to the creation of the Republic of Texas. Naturally, the predominantly American population immediately began petitioning the United States government to annex the new republic and add it to the growing Union, despite fierce debate over admitting what would undoubtedly become another slave state into the Union. It took less than a decade before Texas was annexed by the United States. The annexation of Texas provoked another conflict with Mexico in 1846, as the borders of the Republic of Texas were uncertain and disputed by Mexico. When the United States annexed Texas, Mexico claimed the United States was seizing Mexican land. President James K. Polk tried to negotiate with the Mexican government, offering to pay for the disputed territory in addition to the territories of California, New Mexico, and Arizona. However, the Mexican government refused. In response, Polk sent troops to occupy the disputed territory, which forced Mexican forces to attack a small American detachment. Polk used this incident to persuade Congress to declare war on Mexico. The Mexican army was equipped with outdated flintlock muskets from the Napoleonic era, while the United States was armed with much more modern weapons. Disorganized, poorly supplied, and facing internal political strife at all levels of government, Mexican forces stood little chance against the American Army and Navy, which quickly conquered huge swathes of Mexico and its territories. When the Mexican government finally collapsed, they were forced to cede large territories to the United States, including California and New Mexico, in addition to suffering the humiliation of having to recognize the sovereignty of the Republic of Texas and its subsequent annexation in 1845, lasting from April 1846 to February 1848. The Mexican-American War proved one-sided and clearly demonstrated America's ambition to secure control over the North American continent. There were many who disagreed with the concept of manifest destiny, especially within the Whig Party, the successors to the Federalists, including, by the mid-19th century, a young politician from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. In 1844, manifest destiny came to the forefront as territorial disputes with Britain over Oregon and ongoing tension with Mexico over the Texas territory further divided political parties. As the population of Western territories grew, and they were considered for admission to the Union, the question of whether these areas would allow or prohibit slavery became decisive. The fragile balance of power in Congress between slave and free states was threatened. Since the arrival of the first African slaves in Virginia in 1619, the institution of slavery had become more and more entrenched in the culture and economy of the United States, especially in the South. Although the United States government abolished the slave trade in 1808, it enforced a form of slaveholding within its borders, providing labor for generations of African Americans. Although several slave uprisings occurred in the United States in the early 19th century, including Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, none were successful. In the early 19th century, some slaves attempted to escape and fled north, hoping to find refuge in pro-abolitionist states in the Northeast or in Canada. They traveled north via a series of secret routes to known abolitionist sites and safe houses. Known as the Underground Railroad, the path north was dangerous, and those brave enough to flee slavery received aid from former slaves, free men and women, and sympathetic abolitionists. One such individual was Harriet Tubman. Tubman herself escaped slavery in 1849 and spent many years after that helping more than 70 slaves escape from the South. As the slavery issue approached a boiling point, so did tension within the federal government. In 1854, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina caned Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. Slaveholder sympathizers from across the country sent Brooks new canes with congratulations. Abolitionists saw in this public attack the embodiment of the control the South seemed to have over the country. Could they simply do whatever they wanted and expect nothing but compromise in return? The polarization of the country became completely clear as a result of this incident. It took years of agreements and compromises to come to this impasse. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise declared that Missouri would be a new slave state and Maine a new free state, and that slavery would be prohibited north of Missouri's southern border. In the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, a fragile balance was preserved. Texas joined in 1844 as a slave state, and Oregon was admitted in 1846 as a free state. When the U.S. won over 1 million square miles of territory from Mexico, as a result of the Mexican-American War in 1848, fierce debates arose over whether the new territories would allow slavery. The U.S. gained from the struggle all of modern California, Texas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. According to the resulting agreements, California would become a free state, and the slave trade, but not slavery, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. But a new fugitive slave law would allow Southerners to reclaim escaped slaves who had fled across borders into free states. The compromise allowed the remaining areas to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. In 1854, two new states, Kansas and Nebraska, were to be created from the Louisiana Purchase territory. But Southern legislators objected because, under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, both states would be free. The new compromise provided for popular sovereignty, or, again, allowing settlers of the territories to decide the issue for themselves. The battle for Kansas and Nebraska became the embodiment of the nation's soul. People flooded into the territories and tried to influence the voting, many of them voting illegally. Soon Kansas descended into civil war, a conflict that took hundreds of lives and became known as Bleeding Kansas. Among those who joined the violence was one of the most notorious freedom fighters in American history, John Brown. Brown was a radical preacher and a staunch abolitionist. He repeatedly attempted to provoke armed slave uprisings, and in Kansas, he escalated the violence to the point that he and his followers hacked 5 Kansas slaveholders to death with broadswords. Brown then began planning a raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia, hoping to again inspire the enslaved peoples of the South to rise up against their oppressors. He planned to seize the arsenal and armory at Harper's Ferry, as well as a weapons factory. To arm his uprising, Brown's raid began in October 1859 and was quickly suppressed by the United States Army, U.S. forces, under the leadership of a young colonel named Robert E. Lee. Quickly surrounded the engine house occupied by Brown's men, and after Brown refused to surrender, took the building by force. Brown was tried and executed for treason by the state of Virginia, and in doing so, became a martyr for anti-slavery forces across the country. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a defining moment for the country. It now seemed inevitable that some great conflict would occur to decide the fate of the nation. The election of 1860 was the last straw for the South. Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln ran on a platform of liberal policies that included raising tariffs, improving infrastructure, and expanding railroads. Although Lincoln was an abolitionist and fiercely opposed slavery, he understood that the issue would inevitably tear the country apart, and initially promised to do everything he could to prevent the South from seceding from the Union. However, Lincoln's election as president was enough for some Southern states to make the break. In December 1860, South Carolina led the charge and seceded from the United States. Other Southern states quickly followed. An incumbent President James Buchanan faced a growing disaster. As Southern states seceded, they began confiscating federal forts and arsenals belonging to U.S. armed forces. One such place was Fort Sumter in South Carolina. President Buchanan was unwilling to resupply the garrison, and when Lincoln took office, he faced an almost impossible decision. Lincoln, unwilling to surrender an American fort to rebels or acknowledge their authority, sent a letter to the governor of South Carolina informing him that a ship of food, but no ammunition, would attempt to resupply the fort. This allowed Lincoln to know with satisfaction that if the South opened fire on the fort, they would be the aggressor in any conflict, and if not, he would take steps in negotiations with the rebels as well as retain the fort. This was not to be. On April 9th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered General P.T.G.
This facilitated the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets and increased the speed of westward expansion. As settlers reached the newly accessible territories, conflicts with Native Americans intensified. During this time, the deeds, both real and exaggerated, of infamous outlaws brought the perpetrators fame at the time and an enduring legacy today. Wyatt Earp, a former marshal of Dodge City, Kansas, moved to Tombstone, Arizona territory in 1879 with several of his brothers seeking wealth from the silver boom. While there, the Earps clashed with a gang of outlaws called the Cowboys, led by Ike Clanton. All the Earps had a background in law enforcement, with Virgil Earp serving as Tombstone Town Marshal and U.S. Deputy Marshal. They teamed up with part-time lawman Doc Holliday. The lawman had a long-standing feud with the Clanton gang, but it all came to a head when Virgil made the decision to enforce a town ordinance banning carrying weapons in town, which meant disarming the armed cowboys. This intervention led to a shootout at the OK Corral, a 30-second gunfight that nonetheless became symbolic of the Old West, a time when the frontier was virtually lawless as a consequence of lawmen being incredibly scarce across vast territories. The beginning of the Gilded Age, a period characterized by both wealth and abundance, as well as poverty and corruption, was actually a remarkable ending. 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction, and therefore the end of one of the greatest periods of civil rights reform in the nation's history. The federal government's efforts to protect the rights granted to African Americans after the end of the Civil War were abandoned as a result of a compromise reached to settle the disputed election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Hayes, a Republican from the North, was granted the presidency, and Reconstruction was ended. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, no longer intervening to protect the civil and political rights of African Americans. The systemic violence, disenfranchisement, and oppression that followed would persist for over a century and would be called Jim Crow laws, as the federal government abandoned its promise to grant free black men the rights of citizens in the South. Sharecropping and low-paying jobs, such as domestic service, were among the few options available to freed people in the South. But depending on who you were, what you looked like, and where in the country you were, economic opportunities could abound in Gilded Age America. Cheap land and relatively high wages compared to other parts of the world attracted millions of immigrants. Between 1877 and 1900, approximately 7.3 million people immigrated to the United States. Until 1880, most came from Western Europe and China, but closer to the turn of the century, more immigrants arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe. They settled in every region of the country in large numbers except the economically devastated South. But their arrival provoked a political and social backlash from Americans who felt their white Protestant country was being threatened. Movements to resist certain types of immigrants, including Catholics, Jews, and Chinese, gained strength. In the West, sentiment against Chinese workers was particularly hostile, and crowds were known to gather and attack Chinese living in areas of Wyoming and Washington, driving them out. Congress restricted Chinese immigration to the U.S. starting in 1892, continuing this policy until a permanent exclusionary law was passed in 1902. Fear of minorities gnawed at white Americans after the Reconstruction period and was only fueled by the influx of immigration, leading to anti-democratic attempts to restrict certain groups from voting. As immigrants flooded the country, many of them went west. As a result of the Homestead and Railroad Acts of 1862, the federal government transferred much of the land owned by Native Americans to railroad corporations and white farmers, including immigrants. The Homestead Act did not require American citizenship, and railroads sold land grants at low prices, even going so far as to advertise in Europe. Advancements in technology, such as improved plow designs, meant that just one family could efficiently work a larger area of land without the need for intensive effort or hired labor. But not all farmers were happy. Increasingly, political movements, such as populism, attracted destitute wheat farmers in the Midwest and disgruntled white cotton farmers in the South who were fed up with wealthy elites, monopolistic corporate interests, and gold. Nevertheless, agriculture became so efficient that the country produced more food than it could consume, so surpluses were exported. All this was made possible by the expansion of railroads that occurred in the 1850s and 60s, as they made previously inaccessible land much more feasible and profitable to cultivate. From 1865 to 1898, American wheat production increased by 256%, corn by 222%, coal by 800%, and railroad track mileage by 567%. The country's economy revolved around railroads, which transported goods such as wheat, livestock, silver, and timber from place to place. The first transcontinental railroad opened in 1869, and railroads were a rapidly expanding area of the new economy. By 1890, nearly 800,000 people worked on the railroad. However, railroad work was poorly paid and often dangerous. Even as wages rose and the standard of living for skilled workers in America outpaced that in England, mechanization steadily replaced these skilled workers with unskilled ones who could be paid less. The distribution of wealth in Gilded Age America was extremely uneven. The wealthiest 10% owned more than 3/4 of the national wealth. This inequality, along with poor working conditions that affected the daily lives of wage workers, led to a series of major strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted 52 days before it had to be suppressed by federal troops and the National Guard, but only after over 100 people died as a result of the fighting and workers burned several railroad cars and locomotives. Another major railroad strike occurred in 1886, involving over 200,000 union workers. On May 4, 1886, a gathering at Haymarket Square in Chicago in protest of police brutality against striking workers turned into a riot when someone threw a bomb at police attempting to disperse the crowd. In the ensuing chaos, 7 police officers and 1 protester were killed. In search of the guilty, police in Chicago and elsewhere detained radicals, labor organizers, and anti-capitalists, selecting 8 men who were tried for the Haymarket Square events. However, some considered the trial evidence weak and saw the convicted men, most of whom were sentenced to death, as martyrs. For many others, the takeaway from this event was increased anti-labor sentiment.
Nevertheless, efforts to improve labor rights continued. During the Pullman Strike of 1894, widespread strikes and boycotts seriously disrupted railroad traffic in the Midwest. The strike occurred in response to a wage cut that the Pullman Palace Car Company imposed on its already low-wage workers. The company, however, did not correspondingly lower rent and other expenses in its company town of Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, where most of its workers lived in company housing. Workers and their families were starving, but the company president refused to make any changes and ordered those who complained fired. The workers decided to strike. Some of the workers belonged to the American Railway Union, and union delegates found a way to support the strike. ARU members across the country would boycott the Pullman Company, refusing to attach Pullman-made cars to trains and uncoupling any Pullman cars already attached. The strategy, devised by ARU president and future U.S. presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, soon led to 125,000 workers on 29 railroads walking off the job rather than deal with Pullman cars. By some estimates, the number of workers was closer to 250,000 across 27 states. Although the strike successfully delayed trains, the workers were still angry, and moreover, set fire to engines and caused various riots. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago to suppress the violence and obtained an injunction that stated the ARU could no longer contact any of its members and could do nothing to stop its members from working. Violence erupted between these striking workers and federal troops, culminating on July 6, 1874, when over 6,000 rioters destroyed hundreds of railroad cars in the Pan American Railroad's southern Chicago yards. The strike finally ended only when the railroad began hiring non-union workers to replace those it had lost. Trains ran again. This ordeal cost the railroads millions of dollars in lost revenue and destroyed property, and the strikers lost over $1 million in wages. The Pullman Company was forced to give up its company town, which became part of Chicago, after the federal government investigated and called the company's actions in the town un-American. After the strike, in an attempt to placate still angry workers, the Cleveland administration designated the first Monday in September as Labor Day. But public sentiment was aroused against the strikers, who were mostly immigrant workers. The influx of immigrant workers took advantage of the growing number of industrial jobs available in cities. But these jobs tended to also be exploitative and low-paying, even as the country's GDP became the largest in the world. Gilded Age magnates such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan were known for their philanthropy, but their critics also called them robber barons for building their empires on the backs of the exploited working class, using tactics of intimidation, union busting, fraud, and monopoly to gain an advantage over competitors. Muckrakers, or journalists exposing corruption among the elite, helped draw public attention to these issues. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, his famous account of the horrible, dangerous, and unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, leading to public outrage and legislative changes. Ida Tarbell wrote a 19-part series for McClure's magazine in 1902 about Rockefeller, resulting in his company, Standard Oil, being broken up for monopoly. Meanwhile, as the rich got richer, cities filled with slums and tenements as their populations grew. Another muckraker, photographer Jacob Riis, became famous in 1890 when he published a book called How the Other Half Lives, which featured his photographs of New York City slums, prompting city authorities to try to improve conditions there. When the Great Blizzard of 1888 dumped 40 to 50 inches of snow on the New York area, over 200 people died in New York City alone, most of them buried in snowdrifts along city sidewalks. But unlike the extreme poverty, technological marvels such as new bridges, streetcar lines, subways, elevators, and skyscrapers were ushering cities into the industrial age. Thomas Edison invented the durable light bulb in 1879, and the Pearl Street Power Station brought electric light to a small number of customers in New York City. By the light of the electric bulb, people read newspaper accounts of the Kentucky Meat Shower, a mysterious event that occurred on March 6, 1876.
Residents of Olympia Springs, Kentucky, were shocked to find large chunks of meat falling from the sky, which was never fully explained despite attempts to investigate, although the preferred local explanation was that it was vulture vomit. Construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, connecting the boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn across the East River, began in 1869. When it opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It was an architectural and engineering achievement conceived by John Augustus Roebling, who developed his own method of weaving wire cables. After a site accident killed him early in the project, his son, Washington Roebling, took over project management. At least 20 workers died during construction, and many others were used to build the bridge tower foundations. Workers labored inside a caisson underwater at pressure nearly twice normal atmospheric, and when they returned to the surface, they exhibited symptoms of what was then called caisson disease, but would today be known as decompression sickness. When decompression occurs too quickly, nitrogen bubbles form in the bloodstream and can lead to sharp pains, slurred speech, muscle paralysis, vomiting, and convulsions. Washington Roebling also suffered from caisson disease and became bedridden, though his wife, Emily Roebling, acted as a liaison between her husband and the construction team. When the bridge was finished, she became the first person to ride across it in a carriage, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. The Gilded Age was a time of huge economic fluctuations. The United States experienced unprecedented economic growth, but was also marked by economic recessions that crashed prices. In what became known as the Panic of 1893, problems with international investments, including failed land speculation in South Africa and Australia, and a railroad bubble caused by overbuilding of railroads far outpacing demand, people rushed to banks, withdrawing their money. A series of banks failed, and many companies went bankrupt, including the Northern Pacific and Union Railroads. This led to a huge spike in unemployment. Many people also lost their savings due to bank failures. Many farms ceased operations, and stock prices fell. People faced starvation, turning to any job they could find to feed their families. President Grover Cleveland was blamed for the crisis, and his administration was criticized for how it suppressed the Pullman strikes, so his Democratic Party suffered heavy losses during the 1894 elections. In the next presidential election, in 1896, Democratic candidate William Jayinson Bryan was supported by the populist People's Party, but failed to defeat Republican candidate McKinley B. William McKinley. By the end of the Gilded Age, many people were tired of extreme wealth inequality, abusive magnates, and widespread poverty, and were ready to open a new era of reform, when, after McKinley's assassination, President Theodore Roosevelt took office in 1901. By the end of the 19th century, the United States seemed to have achieved its manifest destiny. The country now stretched from one ocean to the other. It had survived a terrible and bloody civil war and stood on the threshold of a new century. Now, seeking to expand its political, social, and economic resources beyond the North American continent, the United States began to spread its influence to neighboring islands and territories. The first was the Kingdom of Hawaii. Located 2,400 miles, or approximately 3,900 kilometers from the U.S. mainland, the Hawaiian Islands had been under the rule of the Kamehameha dynasty since the late 1700s. In 1846, during the presidency of John Tyler, the United States recognized the independence of the Kingdom of Hawaii and opened trade with the native nation. Enterprising Americans also secured extensive sugarcane plantations on the island, and American immigrants began to flood into Hawaii. The United States and the Kingdom of Hawaii often disagreed over sugar trade, and although Hawaiians appealed to the U.S. government for help, it was often ignored. As the presence of native-born Americans began to predominate on the island, so did the presence of U.S. armed forces. In January 1887, the United States began leasing Pearl Harbor from the Kingdom of Hawaii, giving native-born Hawaiians from the U.S. the confidence to begin plotting against native Hawaiians and the government. In July 1887, they staged an uprising and forced the king to agree to what became known as the Bayonet Constitution, which stripped the king of many of his powers and gave more power to foreign white planters.
In 1891, Hawaiian King Kalakaua died, leaving the throne, an unstable government, and an economically weakened Hawaii to his sister Liliuokalani. Queen Liliuokalani immediately set to work trying to repair the damage done by the Bayonet Constitution, and by 1893 was preparing to organize a rewriting of the Hawaiian government. In direct contradiction, the Committee of Safety, a political council of white landowners from the U.S. and Europe, began gathering forces to overthrow the government again. Both sides quickly mobilized troops, and the Committee of Safety declared the Queen deposed and established the Provisional Republic of Hawaii, headed by Sanford B. Dole. The U.S. Navy responded to a request for aid from the new Provisional Republic and arrived to keep the peace, naturally in favor of the American rebels. The Queen was placed under house arrest and never attempted to fight back, hoping to avoid any unnecessary bloodshed. In Washington, President Grover Cleveland reacted with shock and horror and condemned the Provisional Republic as an illegal coup that did not have the support of the U.S. government. Despite this and several investigations into the events that triggered the coup, the Republic of Hawaii was officially declared legal in 1894. Queen Liliuokalani made her opposition to the illegal coup clear for the rest of her life, but argued that her decision not to fight the U.S.-backed rebels would save lives. In February 1895, rebels on the island of Cuba were fighting for independence from Spanish colonial rule. Graphic depictions of Spain's efforts to suppress the rebellion were published by several American newspapers, and among the American public, support for the rebels grew. The fighting also created economic and political instability in an area very close to the U.S., which worried some Americans. In April 1895, Spain declared a truce and introduced a program granting Cubans limited self-government powers. However, the U.S. had long been interested in expelling European colonial powers from the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. saw its chance when the American battleship USS Maine mysteriously sank while in the port of Havana on February 15, 1898, killing 268 crew members. Using "Remember the Maine" as a rallying cry, war supporters fanned public support for a conflict, blaming Spain for sinking the Maine. The U.S. quickly issued resolutions that declared Cuba's right to independence and demanded the withdrawal of Spanish armed forces, as well as authorizing President William McKinley to use force to ensure withdrawal. The U.S. also stated it did not intend to annex Cuba itself. The Spanish government rejected the American ultimatum and immediately severed diplomatic relations with the U.S. McKinley responded with a naval blockade of Cuba on April 22, 1898, and called for 125,000 military volunteers. First, U.S. forces attacked a Spanish naval squadron anchored in Manila Bay in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. The fleet was destroyed in just 2 hours, and Commodore George Dewey even paused the Battle of Manila Bay to order his crew a second breakfast. Fewer than 10 Americans died in this battle, while the Spanish lost nearly 400. Then, American forces focused on the Spanish Caribbean fleet. Under the leadership of General William Shafter, an army that included future President Theodore Roosevelt and his first volunteer cavalry, the Rough Riders, advanced overland toward the city of Santiago. The Rough Riders played a key role in the Battle of San Juan Hill, where they captured the hill and used it as a strategic location to attack Spain's military stronghold in Santiago. The U.S. Army drove the Spanish fleet out of the port of Santiago, approaching the city from several points. Then the U.S. Navy proceeded to destroy Spain's ships on July 3rd, allowing for a relatively safe siege of the city. An armistice was signed on August 12th. The strength of the American military so outmatched Spain's that future Secretary of State John Hay described the conflict as a splendid little war. The Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war, was signed on December 10, 1898. According to it, Spain renounced its claims to Cuba, ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and transferred the Philippines for $20 million. However, Filipinos were not happy under American control, and in February 1899, the Philippine-American War began, lasting until 1902. 10 times as many American troops died suppressing rebellions in the Philippines as died defeating Spain. The McKinley administration also used the Spanish-American War as a pretext to annex the independent state of Hawaii. The U.S. emerged from the war a world power with new interests in international politics. This soon led the U.S. to a decisive role in the affairs of Europe and the rest of the world. Spurred to action by the suffering caused by the recessions of the late 1900s, the turn of the 20th century was characterized by a desire for change. Many people were tired of the close ties between powerful politicians and businessmen of the Gilded Age, as well as the problems caused by rapid industrialization and urbanization, such as the growth of slums, widespread pollution, and increased labor exploitation. With former Vice President Theodore Roosevelt newly installed in the main cabinet after the assassination of President William McKinley, progressives were ready to transform the American landscape into something much more modern. Roosevelt, who at 43 was the youngest president in the country's history, took office with enthusiasm for the public good. Unlike presidents before him, he used the Sherman Antitrust Act to fight monopolies, including a railroad owned by J.P. Morgan. The Northern Securities Company controlled nearly all rail transport across the northern U.S., and in 1902, Roosevelt went on the offensive and took the case to the Supreme Court, which sided with Roosevelt. And while former President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to suppress a railroad strike in the 1880s, when Roosevelt faced a major miners' strike in 1902, he sent representatives as a neutral mediator. Roosevelt easily won re-election in 1904, campaigning on a platform of a square deal to fight trusts, conserve natural resources, and protect the consumer. As in the Gilded Age, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe continued to arrive in the U.S. in large numbers during the Progressive Era. Between 1900 and the start of war in Europe in 1914, over 13 million immigrants arrived. This meant that the problems of slums and tenements, so common in the Gilded Age, only grew. Progressives, who were mostly white middle-class reformers, viewed the urban poor as a social problem. As early as 1889, reformers Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr opened Hull House in Chicago, one of the early social settlements in North America. It provided social services, including early childhood education and adult education, to poor immigrants. Progressive activists had certain issues they considered more important to address, so reform movements were a patchwork of efforts covering a wide range of social problems. Some progressive reformers sought to expand government powers to curb the negative aspects of capitalism. Companies could no longer simply operate without regulation with the advent of state factory inspectors and public health bureaus, which were tasked with minimizing unsafe working conditions, stopping the sale of poisoned food, and combating contagious diseases. One event that prompted greater corporate regulation was the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, which occurred in Boston when a tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses exploded and sent a wave of sticky molasses through the city streets. The wave was said to move at speeds up to 35 miles per hour and reach heights up to 25 feet. 21 people died and over 150 were injured, and an area of several blocks was flooded to a depth of 2 to 3 feet. The tank was used by the Purity Distilling Company to store molasses before it was piped for fermentation to produce ethanol, an ingredient in alcoholic beverages and a key component of munitions. Although the company claimed the tank was blown up by anarchists, a class-action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the victims, and a court-appointed auditor found the company responsible. It was one of the first class action lawsuits in Massachusetts and provided monetary compensation to the victims' families. Progressive activists sought to clean up big business and government in various ways, including passing more constitutional amendments. The 16th Amendment, which made it legal to impose a progressive income tax based on a person's income, was added in 1909, and the 17th Amendment attempted to make elections fairer by introducing direct election of senators rather than by state legislatures that could be controlled by political bosses in 1913. Other political reforms designed to give citizens more direct control over their governments were the introduction of the initiative and referendum, which allowed citizens to propose laws for a vote without needing support from their legislators. Reformers also sought to streamline government with a short ballot, which was intended to increase government accountability and clarity, and utility commissions sought to stabilize prices for city gas and water, streetcar fares, and railroad rates, while zoning boards and city planning commissions sought to clear slums, improve polluted water resources, and bring order to chaotic land markets.
Other reformers focused on preventing the spread of venereal diseases, ending prostitution, and taking other measures for public health and morality. Among them, the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, led efforts to promote temperance or abstinence from alcohol and discourage premarital sex. Temperance and prohibition were goals taken up by a large number of progressive reformers who saw alcohol as an evil that bred many other problems, such as domestic violence and poverty. These activists, known as DRYs, helped pave the way for various states to pass legislation banning the sale, possession, or transportation of alcohol. In 1907, Georgia and Alabama were the first states to go dry, followed by Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. By 1917, 2/3 of states had prohibition laws, and approximately 3/4 of the population lived in dry areas. With the passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, which began the era of prohibition of alcohol in the U.S., this patchwork system received federal backing. Not all reform projects were carried out by white middle-class people. The Progressive era also saw black communities in the segregated South take on reform projects such as improving schools, seeking a greater share of state budgets, participating in lawsuits to secure equal rights, and environmental efforts. At the same time, however, the country was experiencing a period known as the nadir of race relations, which brought with it some of the worst racial violence and racist policies. During this time, African Americans lost access to many of the rights improvements they had gained during the Reconstruction period. Violence, lynchings, segregation, and legalized racial discrimination all spread. In response, African Americans began increasingly moving north in a period known as the Great Migration. Many of those who migrated moved to northern cities such as New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. They still faced serious hostility, as well as segregation and widespread racism. In the Midwest and West, many places were known as sundown towns, which promised African Americans they would face violence if they stayed there overnight. When President Woodrow Wilson was elected to office in 1912, he made new efforts to segregate federal government facilities. The 1915 film The Birth of a Nation glorified the original Ku Klux Klan and is credited with reviving the Klan's power in the 1920s, even greater than ever before. By 1924, the Klan had 4 million members and significant influence in the governments of several southern and western states. Mass violence against African Americans was widespread. 30 cities across the U.S. witnessed violence by white supremacists in the summer of 1919, which became known as Red Summer. White mobs killed at least 43 black men that year, but a report presented to President Wilson showed that states were unwilling to take any action to prosecute the killings. Many former black soldiers returning from service in World War I were outraged and frustrated by these conditions after fighting for their country. In terms of progressive reforms, many people believe that race relations problems actually stemmed from an integrating society, and reformers fought to strengthen segregation. Between 1895 and 1910, progressives in southern states helped disenfranchise black voters by popularizing the grandfather clause, which limited voting rights to men who were allowed to vote or whose male ancestors could vote before 1867. This disenfranchised black voters because the 15th Amendment, granting them the right to vote, was not adopted until 1870. The Supreme Court declared the grandfather clause unconstitutional in 1915, but its use persisted. It was not until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the 15th Amendment became enforced. As black voters were disenfranchised, voting rights for white women were on their way. Organizations such as the Woman's Christian Temperance Union advocated for women's suffrage while working on other issues such as prohibition. In addition to the sexist sentiments of the time, some opposed women's suffrage because they feared women's votes would tip the scales on issues they opposed, such as the elimination of child labor and the prohibition of alcohol, and increase the share of socialists in the electorate. In 1916, Alice Paul formed the National Woman's Party, which focused on obtaining women's suffrage at the national level. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, to replace men who went to war, women moved into jobs traditionally closed to them, including on ammunition assembly lines. Others worked for the military as auxiliary personnel or nurses at home and abroad. The Army Signal Corps hired women telephone operators to help with communications along the Western Front. These women were highly skilled and bilingual in English and French, but because the War Department prohibited women, except as nurses in hospitals, they were hired only reluctantly. Ultimately, women were accepted to free up more men for the front.
American men sent to fight in France were enthusiastically welcomed by weary Allied troops. The first elements of the American Expeditionary Forces, under the command of General John J. Pershing, arrived in France in June 1917. By early 1918, American troops were arriving at a rate of 10,000 per day, which had a significant impact on the Allies' ability to repel a powerful German spring offensive. Although American commanders initially used flawed tactics that others had already abandoned, leading to high casualty attacks, the influx of American troops contributed to the Allies' strategic position and improved morale. During the 100 Days Offensive of the Allies in 1918, American forces launched an offensive in the Meuse-Argonne. In 47 days, 1.2 million American troops pushed the Germans back 40 miles. Over 26,000 American soldiers died. The 100 Days Offensive helped the Allies win the war, which was officially declared won on November 11, 1918. Overall, in less than 6 months of combat, the U.S. suffered 53,402 combat deaths, and another 63,114 died from accidents and disease. The U.S. quickly terminated military contracts and brought troops home, but the U.S. at the time lacked programs to help veterans adjust to civilian life. In January 1919, the U.S. joined the other allies in Paris to negotiate peace. President Wilson brought a list of 14 points, some of which made it into the final agreement, including the creation of the League of Nations, the world's first intergovernmental organization dedicated to maintaining worldwide peace. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, but the U.S. never ratified the treaty, instead concluding a separate peace treaty with Germany. Wilson, a Democrat, refused to bring any leading Republicans to the peace negotiations, seeking a peace without victory. Republicans controlled the Senate after the 1918 elections and were outraged that Wilson refused to discuss the war, as they wanted Germany's unconditional surrender. As senators were divided, Democrats supporting Wilson versus irreconcilable Republicans and some Democrats who were against the treaty, it proved impossible to obtain the necessary two-thirds majority for its adoption. Democrats who opposed the treaty represented those among the American public, mainly Irish Catholics and German Americans, who were adamantly against the treaty because they believed it favored the British. On November 19, 1919, the Senate rejected a peace treaty for the first time in its history.
Under Wilson's successor, Warren G. Harding, the American-German Peace Treaty was signed on August 25, 1921. The treaty allowed for American-German cooperation outside the sphere of activity of the League of Nations. After World War I, the U.S. entered a period of post-war recovery. The economy boomed, construction went up, and consumer goods, such as automobiles and electricity, became much more affordable. The decade was a time of bold innovation and experimentation, as well as significant backlash to these things from people who did not like the direction the country's culture seemed to be moving. This tumultuous time became known as the Roaring Twenties. In the 1920s, for the first time in history, more Americans, 51%, lived in cities than in villages or on farms. New norms, resulting from trends that had been forming for decades, changed urban life, especially for women. At the beginning of the decade, by old Victorian customs, a quarter to a third of unmarried urban working women lived alone in private apartments or boarding houses, rather than at home with parents. These new women attended public entertainments such as dance halls, amusement parks, and movie theaters, which attracted young people on dates, a structure replacing the old courtship culture. People now had time for such things. As factories and stores mechanized, the urban blue-collar worker spent less time at work. The average work week dropped from 55.9 hours in 1900 to 44.2 hours in 1929. While blue-collar wages rose by 25%, many Americans in the 1920s had extra money thanks to rising incomes and easily available credit, and it became increasingly socially acceptable to spend money on consumer goods and accumulate debt for these goods, even if they were not absolutely necessary. Total national wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. People bought movie tickets to see stars like Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino. By the mid-1920s, movie theaters were selling 50 million tickets each week, a sum equal to roughly half the U.S. population. They bought ready-made clothing, which was mass-produced and therefore became more affordable. They bought radios. In the first-ever live radio broadcast to the public, radio station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, broadcast the results of the presidential election on November 2, 1920. By the end of the 1920s, radios were in over 12 million households. In 1912, an estimated 16% of American households had electricity. By the mid-1920s, it was over 60%. Appliances requiring electricity, such as the washing machine, freezer, and vacuum cleaner, were popular purchases, and people bought cars, which were affordable luxuries. The Ford Model T cost $260 in 1924, which is only about $4,000 today. But even as some people experienced wealth and prosperity, others struggled to make ends meet. The extreme income inequality that had troubled progressives and defined the Gilded Age persisted in the 1920s. The income of the wealthiest 0.1% of families equaled the income of the bottom 42% in the 1920s, and over 40% of Americans lived on less than $1,500 a year, which was the poverty line at the time. Most people outside cities did not experience the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. Agricultural commodity prices fell to a low after World War I. The spread of cars meant people could now travel anywhere, and many young people of the time wanted to go out and dance in jazz clubs. Jazz music was brought north by black artists who came from New Orleans, where the form originated. Chicago became the new center of this art, with over 100 jazz clubs in the city. Whites and blacks began socializing together for the first time in black and white clubs in Chicago. Poet Langston Hughes wrote that midnight was like day, referring to the city's nightlife filled with music. Musicians such as Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Ethel Waters drew crowds to dance halls, and people danced in new styles inspired by African Americans. The Charleston, the cakewalk, the turkey trot, and the flea hop were all popular dances of the time. Some of the main dance clubs of the time were the Cotton Club in Harlem, New York, where Duke Ellington's orchestra played, and the Grand Terrace Cafe in Chicago, where Earl Hines' orchestra played. Later, the center of jazz music moved to New York, where the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. But because jazz music was created by African Americans and represented a departure from traditional white forms of music, significant backlash arose in response to its growing popularity. People declared about the supposed moral catastrophes it created, its roots in black culture, and some called it the devil's music. By the end of the 1920s, at least 60 communities across the country banned jazz in public dance halls. Radio stations broadcast jazz tunes to listeners across the country, and in 1927, 100 million jazz records were sold. But due to discrimination and racism, these were mostly recordings by white bands that sounded similar to the black musicians who first created the genre. Thomas Edison, inventor of the phonograph, mocked jazz music, saying it sounded better played backwards. And Mrs. Faulkner, president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, a powerful alliance of women's, social, and reform groups that began a crusade against jazz in 1921, once said that jazz was originally the accompaniment of the voodoo dancer, stimulating the half-crazed barbarian to the most atrocious deeds. The growing visibility of black culture in jazz and blues music, as well as the arrival of millions of African Americans who moved north during the Great Migration, provoked significant racist backlash. Millions of people joined the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, swelling its numbers to 5 million by 1925. By the middle of the decade, the group controlled the governments of Indiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado, and was extremely powerful in several other states, including California and Georgia. The fundamentalist, conservative paramilitary group initiated white supremacist violence and also targeted Jews, Catholics, Asians, and so-called new women. One of the worst cases of violence was the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, when a mob burned the Black Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma to the ground, killing dozens. The KKK only grew stronger in Oklahoma after this incident. Overall, the 1920s were a time characterized by nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. The Red Scare, during which people tried to hunt down, expose, and persecute communists, took place from 1919 to 1920, and the Klan-backed National Origins Act of 1924 strictly limited immigration from Eastern Europe and Asia, favoring immigrants from Northern Europe and Britain. Federal prohibition of alcohol in 1920, which banned the production and sale of alcoholic beverages nationwide.
In addition to economic turmoil, in 1930, a severe drought gripped the area from Texas to Nebraska, bringing with it severe dust storms and dust that blew away soil, livestock, and crops. This became known as the Dust Bowl and forced many people to migrate from the plains in search of work. From 1930 to 1933, the economic crisis continued to worsen as thousands of banks were forced to close. President Herbert Hoover tried to maintain confidence through voluntary measures, but Hoover was a businessman who believed the government should not directly interfere in the economy and provide economic relief. In 1932, when nearly 15 million people across the country were unemployed, voters chose Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt as their next president, who immediately took action. Within the first 100 days in power, the Roosevelt administration passed legislation aimed at stabilizing banks, stimulating industrial and agricultural production, and creating jobs. The unemployment rate in 1935 was a staggering 20%, so through an executive order, Roosevelt created a permanent jobs program called the Works Progress Administration. From 1935 to 1943, the WPA provided jobs to 8.5 million people, building schools, hospitals, roads, and other public works, as well as engaging in artistic projects, hiring tens of thousands of actors, musicians, writers, and other artists. At its peak in late 1938, over 3.3 million Americans worked for the WPA. They built over 4,000 new school buildings, erected 130 new hospitals, laid roughly 9,000 miles of storm drains and sewer lines, built 29,000 new bridges, constructed 150 new airfields, laid or repaired 280,000 miles of roads, and planted 24 million trees to mitigate topsoil loss during the Dust Bowl. Among the most famous projects built by the WPA are the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, LaGuardia Airport in Queens, and the famous red San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. New Deal funds were also used to build Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. The faces of U.S. Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln were carved into the rock by a total of about 400 workers. Tools were forged by blacksmiths, and cable car operators transported people and equipment to the base of the remote mountain and back. The project cost almost $1 million, about 85% of which came from federal funds. The WPA was criticized for the project's slowness and inefficiency, but it was praised for employing millions of people suffering during the Depression. Other notable New Deal programs included the creation of the Social Security Administration for financial protection of elderly Americans, the Agricultural Adjustment Act to help farmers get out of debt, and the U.S. Housing Authority was created to address homelessness. The National Labor Relations Act was passed to protect labor organizing in 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established maximum hours and a minimum wage for most workers. But not everyone was a fan of Roosevelt's reforms. Conservative opponents called them excessive government interference. After the 1938 elections, New Deal policies became harder to pass because the new Congress was less liberal and less inclined to spend. The election of these new conservative members of Congress was largely due to falling public opinion regarding the Roosevelt administration during the economic recession of 1937-38. Since Roosevelt had taken credit for previous economic improvements, people blamed him for the setback. Nevertheless, the popularity of the New Deal helped the Democratic Party remain the ruling party in national politics well into the 1960s. When World War II began in Europe in the fall of 1939, the overwhelming majority of Americans still favored isolationism. However, President Roosevelt understood the importance of ensuring that Britain and France had every chance of success in the conflict. When France completely fell in June 1940, Roosevelt began implementing a Lend-Lease program with the British, sending war materials and humanitarian supplies on American ships. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese fleet finally appeared and struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack caused serious damage to the fleet, destroying 3 battleships and damaging several other ships. However, the Japanese failed to destroy American aircraft carriers. The attack shocked and outraged Americans. Americans hoped the attack would disable the American Pacific Fleet and allow them to quickly seize control of the Pacific Theater. Instead, the Americans recovered with almost inhuman speed and in less than 6 months dealt a crushing blow to the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. The American victory at Midway opened the Pacific to the U.S. fleet and allowed for the safe transport of American ground forces to the Japanese islands. In Europe, after a universal declaration of war on Japan following Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, declared war on the United States, joining his Axis ally. The Allies, now part of the Allied powers, sought to help Britain regain control of the European theater. The War Department began planning a series of operations to retake North Africa and Europe from fascist regimes, simultaneously planning a prolonged invasion of dozens of islands to help Australia and the Philippines from Japan. The Allies focused their efforts on a Germany-first strategy, recognizing the Nazi threat as the most immediate danger. In November 1942, Operation Torch landed American and British troops in North Africa, opening a new front against Axis forces. By May 1943, the Allies completed the North African campaign, capturing over 250,000 Axis soldiers.
The subsequent invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and then mainland Italy in September 1943 overthrew Mussolini's regime and took Italy out of the war, although German troops continued fierce resistance on the Italian peninsula. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fight against Germany, which bought the Allies time to build up their forces. The decisive moment came in June 1944, when Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, landed Allied troops on the coast of Normandy. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies broke through German defenses and began a rapid advance through France. Paris was liberated in August. In the east, Soviet troops began a massive offensive, pushing the Germans back towards Germany. By early 1945, the Allies from the west and Soviet troops from the east were tightening the ring around Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, in his bunker in Berlin, and on May 7, Germany surrendered unconditionally, marking the end of World War II. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. pursued a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions and capturing key islands to create airfields and supply bases. Fierce battles on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa demonstrated fanatical resistance from Japanese troops and high casualties on both sides. By the summer of 1945, American bombers were regularly raiding Japanese cities, and a naval blockade paralyzed the Japanese economy. However, Japanese leadership refused to surrender, preparing for a defense of the homeland that was estimated to cost millions of lives. Seeking to avoid a bloody invasion, President Harry Truman, who succeeded the deceased Roosevelt in April 1945, authorized the use of a new weapon of unprecedented destructive power, the atomic bomb, developed under the top-secret Manhattan Project. On August 6, 1945, the bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, instantly destroying the city and killing about 80,000 people. On August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The official surrender signing ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, ending World War II. The war left the world in ruins. Total losses are estimated at 70 to 85 million. In the post-war years, the United States faced the dual task of converting the economy to peacetime and confronting the growing influence of the Soviet Union. Europe lay in ruins, and in 1947 the Truman Doctrine was proclaimed, initiating the policy of containing communism. The Marshall Plan, 1948 to 1951, provided billions of dollars for the reconstruction of Western Europe, strengthening economic ties and creating markets for American goods. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was created to coordinate defense. In that same year, the USSR successfully tested its atomic bomb, initiating an arms race. The 1950s became an era of economic boom, suburban growth, and conformity. The GI Bill allowed millions of veterans to get an education and take out mortgages, stimulating housing construction and the growth of the middle class. The automotive industry flourished, and the interstate highway system, the construction of which was approved in 1956, changed the landscape and way of life. However, beneath the surface of prosperity, social tensions seethed. The civil rights movement gained strength. In 1954, the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education overturned racial segregation in schools. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, inspired by Rosa Parks and led by a young